We have former Minister of Foreign Affairs and CARICOM Affairs, Mr. Dr. Amery Browne, with us. He is live with us. Can you hear us loud and clear? Good morning.
Good morning, sir. Yes, I'm hearing you loud and very clear.
Fantastic. Thank you for being with us this morning. And just as you're here, I mean, persons will talk about diplomacy and exercising a certain level of diplomacy when speaking to issues regarding foreign affairs and so on. But you would have served for what, since 2020 to
5
2025
years.
as the minister, that's 5 years. What would you mark or point to as your, or as a significant moment where you would have achieved diplomatic and a diplomatic achievement per se?
Well, there were a number of achievements. I would say probably the most outstanding during that period would have been Trinidad and Tobago being successful in its campaign and appointment as President of the United Nations General Assembly. In that particular matter, I actually had to go back in time, uh, examine the resumes and prospects of a number of senior diplomats, many of whom were retired from the service, and selected and offered to the cabinet one Mr. Dennis Francis, who was approved by cabinet. We ran a successful campaign, and he served for 1 year in the very, very prestigious position as President of the United Nations General Assembly during a very tumultuous time in world affairs. You recall it was during that period that we had the intensification of the Ukraine conflict. The Gaza situation was becoming far more intractable at that point as well. And his service was outstanding. And I would say that is one of our big achievements during the period when I served this country as our Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs. There were many others. If you wish, we can get into. But if you ask for one, that that would be the big ticket.
And thank you for that. And of course, that was a significant moment indeed. And just looking at what entities like the UN and they would provide in terms of de-escalating situations, in terms of peace, I want to head straight into the zone of peace. What does that term mean? I know that you particularly once described CARICOM as striving to maintain the Caribbean Sea as a zone of peace. We hear it from time to time. Even the Prime Minister of Barbados recently, was it at the opening of CARIFESTA? I'm not
Yes.
too sure, I stand to be corrected, but recently she would have echoed the sentiment of maintaining that zone of peace within and around our region. What exactly does that mean? And are we successful in maintaining this quote unquote zone of peace?
Well, yes. Really, it's an aspiration that is of several years vintage, whereby uh, CARICOM has escalated the importance of maintaining peaceful relations within this particular zone. Uh, there have also been steps to ensure that the Caribbean Sea is nuclear free. There were measures to reduce and eliminate the transit of hazardous material through the Caribbean Sea, but particularly with respect to uh, conflict between nations, which we see all around the world. The, the Caribbean region has had a fairly good record in recent years and decades in avoidance of that kind of overt conflict, even though there have been tensions and controversies from time to time. So this is a concept that CARICOM has deemed very important and still deems very important. Obviously, some of the new leadership, particularly that offered by Trinidad and Tobago since April 2025, has a different complexion on this issue. I saw the Prime Minister and some other leading figures of this government basically making light of that concept, which is unfortunate because that has certainly become part of CARICOM ethos and something that, in its phrasing and referencing, has served to unite the philosophies around the region. So whether you might lean slightly to the left or slightly to the right, all our leadership up to this point has basically held to this mantra, which guides us away from tension, guides us away from threats of the deployment of armed force, and guides us toward a more fraternal and productive relationship between states that are washed by the beautiful waters of the Caribbean Sea.
Dr. Amery Browne is with us this morning, giving us a perspective in terms of what is happening around us, CARICOM affairs as well, and particularly looking at this U.S.-Venezuela situation. Now, this U.S.-Venezuela situation that is ongoing, how realistic is this vision towards having a zone of peace? Or are we blowing this situation out of proportion with regards to looking at the position that our government, Trinidad and Tobago's government, is taking?
Well, I don't think anything is being blown out of proportion. There is rightfully a significant degree of media and public attention to a much heralded and triumph mobilization of some very unusual United States naval assets to the Southern Caribbean, ostensibly to treat with what they've described as cartel activity and drug trafficking, etc. But there are legitimate questions that have arisen, not just from within the Trinidad and Tobago society, but across the region, frankly, where intelligent and right-thinking observers have examined this mobilization and have deemed it not in keeping with the normal anti-drug assets and activities. For example, we've heard very little, in fact, nothing of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, associated with this current initiative. That's very unusual because you're talking about narcotics and cartels. And the fact is the DEA has a presence here in Trinidad and Tobago, but they clearly do not have anything resembling an important role in this particular mobilization, which could lead some to conclude that this is not really related, or to ask questions as to the connection between the mobilization of this large force, and including up to 4,000 Marines, and the label of anti-drug activity. Another thread of questioning has to do with the degree of collaboration between these naval assets and their leadership and the Coast Guard and defense forces within the region of Grenada, Trinidad and Tobago, Colombia, Barbados, and the other countries that form the Southern Caribbean Sea. So if there is to be a successful effort and mobilization to interdict a movement of cartels, etc., it would stand to reason, as has been done in the past, that there would be some degree of heightened coordination and collaboration with the Coast Guards and other forces in the region. We don't have large vessels in international waters somehow magically providing coverage and interdiction and the kind of network that would be necessary to achieve success. All local media reported recently that there was a meeting of senior leadership of our defense force, all arms, had a meeting at Defense Force headquarters. And according to the reports in The Guardian, etc., there was absolutely no reference during this meeting to the United States mobilization or any collaboration being requested or generated with Trinidad and Tobago. So all of this provides a backdrop which is not consistent with the official line being presented. And the fact that the Prime Minister and government so swiftly and against precedent and maybe good advice, have simply given a blanket full support label to Trinidad and Tobago's foreign policy position at this time is unusual and demands some further question and concern from the national community. And we've seen those questions arising in the media space. A number of stakeholders, even former UNC ministers, very unusually have come forward sounding a note of caution and reminding of the importance of CARICOM solidarity, which has guided us through a number of controversies and issues of concern in the past, but which seems to not be a priority of the current government of Trinidad.
Well, it's very interesting that you brought that perspective there. But recently, probably like about 5 days ago or so, the U.S. would have, via Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary, he would have listed Trinidad and Tobago among some other territories as part of a U.S. coalition or something. Is that linked to this particular arrangement? Just put that into perspective before we continue the conversation.
Well, I think that's a really good question. Frankly, that question would be best posed to a Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago or a senior cabinet minister who really should present themselves before the media and the public to really answer questions and provide transparency to our current foreign policy position. That has not occurred. There have been little snippets. There's been a really atrocious statement issued by the Prime Minister, very poorly scripted, full of grammatical errors, repetitions, and slogans. But there hasn't been anything that would allow us to properly interpret and understand where they're taking Trinidad and Tobago's foreign policy at this time. So what you have is we are now relying on other capitals to shine light on what we are doing here. So there was a reference by the United States Secretary of State, very distinguished diplomat in his own right, Marco Rubio, in a post-cabinet meeting, not in Port of Spain, in Washington, D.C., listing Trinidad and Tobago as what he described as part of some type of coalition against drug trafficking or cartel. No details were provided, and since that date, none, of course, have been provided by the government of Trinidad and Tobago. But if you look at the other countries that are listed, it's quite an interesting grouping. Now, bear in mind, we have over 35 countries in the Western Hemisphere that would potentially be part of some properly coordinated effort against these multinational cartels. But just a list of 5 countries is mentioned. Guyana, I would say maybe understandably and for obvious reasons at this time, which we could get into. Argentina, which is very much a right-wing regime at this time, extremely close to Washington, D.C. We could examine that further if you wish. Then there was Paraguay, quite similar, very much a right-wing regime at this time, very close to Washington, D.C. And when I say close to Washington, D.C., I'm referring to the Trump administration specifically. Ecuador, again, a right-wing president. And then, guess what? Little Trinidad and Tobago is there. The rest
Surprised.
of CARICOM, not mentioned. Well, we should be surprised because that is not the company in that listing that a nation like Trinidad and Tobago normally would be found in. Normally, before we would form any such association, we would have significant interaction with the Caribbean community. And I don't want us to make light of that because we have specific responsibilities which this current Prime Minister, Kamala Prasad Bissessar, has not undertaken in any way, shape, or form. I would remind you that there's CARICOM has a cabinet. Each country has their cabinet, but CARICOM has a cabinet, referred to as the quasi-cabinet of CARICOM. And within this cabinet, various states, member states, have lead responsibility on thematic issues. So Guyana has responsibility within the CARICOM cabinet for food security and agriculture. Uh, and for example, Grenada has lead responsibility. I believe it is on IT and youth issues. Trinidad and Tobago specifically has lead responsibility on regional security. So the fact that there would be this type of security mobilization, issues of some coalition, issues of sending a large deployment of U.S. naval vessels into our region, and Trinidad and Tobago uh, is not taking up its responsibility. It's not seeking the convening of CARICOM defense ministers or ministers of national security or a summit of heads, an emergency forum of heads or foreign ministers to treat with this matter, but is rather issuing a weekend statement under the hand of the Prime Minister, literally dismissing the role of CARICOM in this matter, is a very troubling sign, not just to me, but to all right-thinking citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. We're a founding member of CARICOM, and to dismiss CARICOM in this manner, and to relegate it to a minor role or non-role in such a significant regional development,
But Dr.
this
Browne,
will take years to assuage in the future.
Dr. Browne, you, of course, would have served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs and CARICOM Affairs. And just based on your experience, I mean,
Yeah.
how would a small country like Trinidad and Tobago, in the grand scheme of things, navigate these geopolitical rivalries without
We've
being caught in the middle? How are we to navigate based on
we've
your
done it.
experience?
We've done it. First of all, it's a good question, but we've done it in the past. These are not easy times. These are not easy decisions. But the first thing you have to do is go back to first principle. Go back to the foundation of our foreign policy. Go back to the pillars and foundations of CARICOM itself. Trinidad and Tobago's foreign policy is firmly based on the United Nations Charter, respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of member states, is firmly based on international law, is firmly based on the avoidance of the use of force or the threat of the use of force in relations between member states, etc., etc., etc. The Prime Minister and her government have made no reference to any of these principles in any of their output or proclamations since this renewed tension has risen to a peak. And that is very worrisome to me as a foreign minister and is of concern to many others, including some still serving within the system, who are wondering what is going on today, where
Agreed.
uh, populist rhetoric, some would say sounding very much like a right-wing type of rhetoric, has taken over sound reasoning and diplomacy, and where we would be so willing to just close our eyes and place a rubber stamp on something of significant importance and concern to not just our country, but the wider region. So we've been involved in tension before. You recall during the Trump administration, part one, there were concerns about potential invasion of Venezuela at that time. And there were predictions of a catastrophe, a humanitarian catastrophe. It was our former Prime Minister, born on the beautiful island of Tobago, Dr. Keith Rowley, who was very skillful, working shoulder to shoulder with Mia Mottley and several others in assuaging and balancing and having meetings at the United Nations and really positioning CARICOM not as a participant in the tension, but as a mechanism to help reduce it. I would say those efforts were successful to the extent that the zone of peace was maintained during that difficult period. Tensions actually subsided to a great extent. Even to this day, there's trading and petrochemical exchange between the United States and Venezuela, etc. But now the tensions are rising. The disposition of Trinidad and Tobago is less principled at this time, and we found ourselves being regarded, rightfully or wrongfully, as almost an ally of one side, which is not really the role of a small state like ours. You'd recall Errol Barrow's philosophy, one of the founding fathers of CARICOM, when he said, "We are called upon to be friends of all and satellites of none." So
Yes.
we've been very good friends of the United States of America. And myself, Prime Minister Rowley, for other former ministers, including our former energy ministers, spent a lot of time engaging with U.S. leadership, going to Washington, D.C., really building and maintaining strong ties with the United States of America, but also contributing to a multipolar world and really a multipolar region where other states, have to respect our sovereign position, where we build relations not just with one country or one pole, but with a multiplicity of nations, all in the sovereign interest of Trinidad and Tobago, not the
Doc,
interest of some other capital, in our
Dr.
own
Brown,
interest. So good relations with China, the United Nations, the European Union, the UK, Canada, many other states as well. That is how we've really designed and positioned ourselves as a small state. And
Dr.
that will
Brown,
save us in the long run. Yes.
and sorry to cut you, but in the interest of time, right? So the as you mentioned, taking positions and so on, Trinidad and Tobago has its interest in the energy sector with Venezuela and also the migration situation, the migration pressures.
Yes.
If this US Venezuela situation continues to escalate, um, how would those two particular situation pan out in terms of the migration situation and the energy sector?
Well, those are, again, very good questions. One of the lessons I learned very early in my tenure, really taught by Mr. Dr. Rowley himself to me, was when you stand on principle, your decisions will stand the test of time. The same Kamala Prasad successor, remember when the UNC in opposition recognized Juan Guaido as president of Venezuela and really jumped on the bandwagon with the first Trump administration in that regard. That decision was not based on principle, and it has not stood the test of time. That's just an example of when you make decisions based on convenience, history will judge you unkindly, because where's Guaido today? Suppose Trinidad and Tobago had taken the bad advice of the UNC at that time, we'd be in an untenable position now. In like manner, uh, as we stand today, we find ourselves drifting into uncharted waters. And as I said earlier, it would take some effort in the future to restore Trinidad and Tobago's prestige and value within this region, because significant damage is being done today. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, and but I never take a position of negativity or a position that it is a hopeless circumstance. It's still my hope that.
And I think we lost the last few words from you there. Dr. Brown, are you still with us? Okay, we lost his audio there. Dr. Amery Browne,
Sean
former.
Sobers giving a, a, a line that seems quite different to the prime minister's, at least initially. You'd have seen Ralph Maraj, who's ambassador by his title to CARICOM, talking a lot about regime change in Caracas, and he was even more extreme. So there are a range of positions, and we are left to try to decipher and sift through to determine what is Trinidad and Tobago's position in these matters. There's genuine cause for concern, and I'm quite heartened, though, that many members of our society have found ways to speak up, to express their concern, and the media has been able to reflect that. It's not just a case of people closing their eyes and accepting what the government is serving at this time.
There was a recently held press conference from the ambassador to Trinidad, the Venezuelan ambassador to Trinidad, and just paraphrasing one of the comments made, he said that the U.S. is framing a narrative that looks like or resembles protection with regards to the drug cartel trade and so on, as opposed to power or control. Just quickly your comments on that, and also in terms of control, our Prime Minister would have spoken specifically to the Guyana situation and how we can support Guyana in the event that Venezuela interferes with the Essequibo situation. Just ties those two point of views together, if possible, in terms of protection.
All right. So very quickly, yes, we have significant energy interests with respect to the cross-border fields with Venezuela, and that has to guide our position in these matters. We did not agree with the UNC's very dyspeptic view of the cross-border gas and their negativity in that regard, and well, things seem to be a bit on pause in that regard at this time. But that oil and gas was there for centuries, long before we existed. And it will be there for a long time until some arrangement is made for its exploitation and to bring it to market. It certainly will outlast this current government, and frankly, it will outlast the current U.S. administration. So we have to take a responsible, long-term view with respect to managing and balancing our relations. With respect to the Guyana-Venezuela border controversy, Trinidad and Tobago and CARICOM have maintained a very principled position of support for Guyana in this matter, in keeping with international law and the fact that this controversy is now properly before the International Court of Justice at this time. Fortunately, Venezuela has decided to participate, submit its counter memorials, and is a part of that process. And I would say that is in part a reward for CELAC and CARICOM's diligent and consistent efforts not to increase tension or ratchet up the tension, but to reduce it and to steer the matter into the proper channels of diplomacy and international legal jurisprudence where it belongs. And we, as I say, have been very supportive of Guyana in these matters. I recall very quietly when some Guyanese fishing vessels were seized, large fishing vessels, not pirogues, were seized, and the captains and crew were being held in Venezuela. It is Trinidad and Tobago and the former Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, whom you are speaking right now, who got engaged, who brought in the Venezuelan ambassador and deployed not rhetoric, but true diplomacy, which resulted in the release of those vessels, release of those crews, and continuance and maintenance of peace within the region. Those tools remain available. The tools of diplomacy and proper engagement remain available to all parties and all stakeholders.
Okay.
We cannot abandon our principles in the pursuit of temporary relief or solution.
And you maintain that idea of maintaining principles as we deal with, especially diplomatic relations. And we want to thank you, and we do appreciate you speaking with us this morning, Dr. Amery Browne, who's also an opposition senator. And just quickly before we close, in terms of what you anticipate coming out of CARICOM, I know Jamaica is on their election is in full swing.
Yes.
But the chairman,
Yes.
which is the
It's
Prime Minister
tomorrow.
from Jamaica, Andrew Holness, we're yet to hear anything definite with regards to the U.S.-Venezuela situation. Do you
Well,
anticipate
I
any
have to
statement?
give credit, and a sort of backhanded credit, to Kamala Prasad Bissessar for that, because she fired a shot across the bow of CARICOM even before they could meet and discuss. When she issued a statement saying that Trinidad and Tobago has no intention of engaging CARICOM on this matter, what does that say to a chairman of CARICOM? What is that saying to a Secretary General of CARICOM? When a founding member state, a leading voice, a leading light in CARICOM says from the onset, it has no intention of engaging with CARICOM on this important matter, and then went on to say each member state can speak for themselves on this issue. So that really was, I believe, deliberate and strategic attempt and decision to vaccinate, inoculate this issue from the prospect of CARICOM forming consensus or solidarity on the matter. And it appears that she's achieved the objective. I didn't say her objective, the objective in such regard. So there are still efforts within CARICOM circles to form a consensus. But with Trinidad and Tobago's very ill-judged and ill-timed salvo shot across the bows of CARICOM publicly, that has made it much more difficult for any other CARICOM leader to step forward now, because in saying anything different, it really draws CARICOM into direct contradiction with member state Trinidad and Tobago, which, as I said, has the lead responsibility for regional security.
And we could go on and on with this conversation. I know one, and I would chime it in very quickly. Persons would say the Prime Minister's stance is minding Trinidad and Tobago's business, as opposed to CARICOM, which wouldn't necessarily cater to the individual territories in taking certain stances. Just quickly, your
Always
response to that.
increasing tension with Venezuela, our largest and closest sovereign neighbor, minding Trinidad and Tobago's business. Again, that takes us back to very simplistic rhetoric, which is used in other capitals at this time, where you talk about America first and Russia first and so on. Really a cover for a different introduction of a different type of philosophy. And behind those labels, you have sometimes activities, policies, and actions which have nothing to do with the national interest. So no sensible citizen would fall for this as a putting Trinidad and Tobago first position. Because if you put CARICOM last, you're not putting Trinidad and Tobago first. You're putting somebody outside of the region first, and that will never be in the interest of our nation.
All right, thank you for your comments there. Dr. Amery Browne, of course, former Minister of Foreign Affairs and CARICOM Affairs and current opposition senator. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you. God bless. Have a great day.